So it is now my pleasure to introduce Ido Shalev, a doctoral student, a local doctoral student from Ben-Gurion University.
Hi everyone, my name is Ido and I'm a PhD candidate at Ben-Gurion University, under the supervision of Professor Florina Yusufovsky. And I would like to introduce you today, louder, oh sorry, maybe I'll fix this.
So Ido maybe can speak louder, but we can also maybe speak less.
Is that better? Yes? All right. So I would like to introduce you today our study where we collaborated with Dr. Rachel Mosley and Dr. Nicola Gregory from Bournemouth University in England. In this study, we try to understand non-suicidal self-injury in autism and its potential correlation with a different understanding of empathy that we currently work on. Before I begin, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that the topic of self-injury behaviors can be sensitive and potentially distressing for some. So please take care of yourself and pay attention to how you feel throughout this presentation. Non-suicidal self-injury, or in short, NSSI, refers to when a person intentionally causes harm to themselves without the intention to die. This can take the form of behaviors such as cutting, scratching, biting, or burning. Beyond the physical damage, which can be severe, engagement in NSSI is also related to poor mental health, and although NSSI in itself is without a suicidal intention, it is related to an increased risk for suicide. Sadly, the rate of NSSI among autistic people is alarmingly high. Although a precise estimate is not well established, research suggests that more than half of all autistic individuals without an intellectual disability engaged in NSSI at some point in their lives. It's important to know that there are different reasons for engaging in NSSI, and while there is limited research on NSSI and autism, the most frequently reported reason for engaging in NSSI in autistic people was to regulate emotional reactivity, and some individuals describe it as helpful in controlling overwhelming feelings. Therefore, understanding emotional reactivity and the root causes of overwhelming feelings in autistic people can be crucial in predicting and ultimately reducing NSSI and to deal with overwhelming feelings in a less harmful way. Feeling overwhelmed with emotions can have internal causes, but it can also have external causes. Particularly in the context of autism, where social demands and communication challenges can play a role. In our study, we focused on the role of interpersonal and social factors in emotional reactivity and possibly with the experience of feeling overwhelmed with the emotions of others. When we engage in social situations, especially in emotional ones, we continuously try to understand what is going on, what is the other person feeling, but we also pick up the emotional atmosphere around us and we share emotions of other person. This ability to understand and share another person's emotions is called empathy. It is generally accepted that empathy is comprised of two distinct capabilities. Our ability to understand what others feel and to take their perspective, which is called cognitive empathy, and our ability to share emotional experience of others while maintaining a self-other distinction, which is called emotional empathy. So for example, when we see someone sad, cognitive empathy helps us understand what that person feels, that this person is currently feeling sad, and why he or she may be feeling this way, while emotional empathy allows us to experience the sadness ourselves. Emotional and cognitive empathy each have a unique neurobiological pathway, which often led researchers to examine each component separately. When doing so, many studies show that autistic people do not differ in their ability to share the emotional experience of others, but some studies suggest that they do struggle with cognitive empathy. But these results are inconsistent, with some studies showing no differences in cognitive empathy, while others show inconsistencies regarding emotional empathies as well. This has left the relationship between empathy and autism somewhat unclear. Furthermore, looking at emotional and cognitive empathy separately in that way somewhat focus only on potential deficits in empathy among autistic people. And that sometimes became the source of stigmatization and misunderstanding of autistic people. But the thing is that when asked, a lot of autistic people and their parents will tell you that they or their child actually feels too much empathy. Some claims that this is due to a different style of interaction and empathy and different style of empathy among autistic people. But how can that be that this is not reflected in most of the quantitative and empirical literature on empathy and autism? This raises the question of whether a different approach is needed in examining empathy and its relationship with autism. Like I said earlier, cognitive and emotional empathy are examined separately, but there are links between these two systems, and these links are often neglected in most studies. And to address this, we have recently introduced the term empathic disequilibrium, which refers to the degree of similarity and dissimilarity between emotional and cognitive empathy. To get a better understanding of this empathic disequilibrium, let's look at the following plot. Cognitive empathy is displayed on the x-axis and the emotional empathy on the y-axis. Each point describes the emotional empathy and cognitive empathy of one person. For example, if we look at the point highlighted in red, we can see that this person has an above-average cognitive empathy and a very high emotional empathy. So overall, this person might be considered a rather empathic person. But its level of emotional empathy is still much higher than his cognitive empathy levels. This means that they have a high degree of empathic disequilibrium. And we see that in multiple studies that people's degree of empathy is pretty much unrelated to the level of balance or imbalance between their emotional and cognitive empathy. And we might think of empathic disequilibrium as a different way to experience empathy that is unrelated to whether we are empathetic or not. We definitely think of this concept as a continuous one. And empathic disequilibrium is normally distributed in the general population. But based on similarity and dissimilarity between the emotional and cognitive empathy, we can define three groups. The first group is emotional empathy dominance, where the emotional empathy is relatively higher than the cognitive empathy. The second one is cognitive empathy dominance, where cognitive empathy is relatively much higher than the emotional empathy levels. And balanced empathy, where the levels of emotional and cognitive empathy are pretty much equal. It's important to remember that each autistic people is unique. But in a previous findings, we found that on average, autistic people tend to show emotional empathy dominance, meaning that their emotional empathy is much higher than their cognitive empathy. And this was regardless of the general levels of empathy. In this plot, we can see the distribution of empathic disequilibrium in non-autistic on the top panels and autistic individuals on the bottom, with the mean of each distribution depicted in red, and numbers are in standard deviations. And we can see that in autistic people, the whole distribution is shifted towards emotional empathy dominance. We can also see that this is particularly evident in autistic women. But what does it mean to have this form of experience? While a person with such empathic disequilibrium might understand others' mental states, his or her ability to respond to these mental states will still be relatively higher. And we suggested that this state of feeling more than we can understand might translate into feeling overwhelmed with the emotions of others. With that, let's come back to the overwhelming dysregulated emotional reactivity experience that, like I said earlier, was found to be related to NSSI. We claim that empathic disequilibrium might be related to heightened emotional reactivity that we are unable to regulate. And as such, individuals who experience this form of empathic disequilibrium could be more likely to engage in NSSI. In this study, we first wanted to replicate our previous findings, suggesting autism would be characterized by emotional empathy dominance, empathic disequilibrium. Second, we wanted to examine whether empathic disequilibrium will be associated with greater emotional reactivity. And third, mediated by this heightened emotional reactivity, we suggest that individuals with empathic disequilibrium may be more likely to engage in NSSI. We also examined whether this mediation model differed between autistic and non-autistic people. For this study, we gathered participants from the UK, including 304 individuals on the autism spectrum and 289 neurotypical individuals who were matched in terms of gender and age. All participants self-reported on their empathy and emotional reactivity using well-validated and commonly used measures. Empathy was measured using the interpersonal reactivity index, which can be divided into emotional empathy and cognitive empathy subscales. For example, the item, when I'm upset at someone, I usually try to put myself in his or her shoes for a while, assess cognitive empathy. And items such as when I see someone being taken advantage of, I feel kind of protective towards them, would assess emotional empathy. Emotional reactivity was measured using the emotional reactivity scale with questions such as, I experience emotions very strongly. We then asked participants regarding their engagement in NSSI. We explained the definition of NSSI and asked about whether the participant ever engaged in this behavior, providing a binary outcome. And participants who engaged in self-harm were also asked to elaborate on the number of occasions that they engaged in NSSI. Because the relationship between NSSI and depression is well established, we also measured depression and controlled for it in all our analyses. To assess empathic disequilibrium, we used a method called polynomial regression with response surface analysis. Unfortunately, I won't have the time to get into the details of this method, but in short, this is a way to simultaneously represent lines of congruency and incongruency between two variables, in this case, emotional and cognitive empathy, and associated with an outcome variable. And this methodology provides better interpretability and helps dealing with some problems of using the traditional difference scores. Of course, if you're interested in the statistical consideration, I'll be happy to elaborate on this method after the talk. For our purposes, you can definitely think of the results I will describe in a minute as mediation or regression models. So for the results. Regarding NSSI rates, in our study, we found that 62% of autistic individuals engaged in NSSI, with 44% engaging in it in the past year. Firstly, we wanted to see if previous findings regarding autism and empathic disequilibrium will be replicated in our sample. Our results show that empathic disequilibrium was a very strong predictor of autism diagnosis, with a tendency towards emotional empathy dominance. It should be noted that the overall levels of empathy were entirely unrelated to autism. Meaning, autistic people are not more or less empathic than non-autistic people, but on average, they have this unique experience of empathy. Next, we wanted to see whether empathic disequilibrium related to emotional reactivity and to NSSI. In line with our hypothesis, empathic disequilibrium was indeed very strongly correlated with emotional reactivity for both autistic and non-autistic population. But does empathic disequilibrium relate to NSSI? And the answer is yes, it does, but this was true only for autistic people. Specifically, autistic people who show this pattern of higher emotional than cognitive empathy were more likely to engage in NSSI throughout their lifetime. Empathic disequilibrium also predicted the number of occasions autistic people engaged in NSSI. Again, both findings were unrelated to the general levels of empathy, who did not predict NSSI. Our results suggest that this association between empathic disequilibrium and NSSI was explained and mediated by increased emotional reactivity. In contrast, different patterns were found for non-autistic population where overall empathy but not empathic disequilibrium was related to NSSI. To summarize, empathic disequilibrium provides a different way to understand how we react to other emotions in both autistic and non-autistic people. This is the second study suggesting that empathic disequilibrium is quite common among autistic people. It is important to keep in mind that every individual is unique, of course, but perhaps empathic disequilibrium could improve our understanding and compassion towards this different type of communication. There's still a lot to learn about empathic disequilibrium, but our findings suggest a connection between this experience of feeling more than we can understand when facing the emotions of others and an increased emotional response, which can be overwhelming and sometimes be associated with NSSI in autistic people. Further research is needed to fully understand this relationship, but exploring empathic disequilibrium as a factor may offer a way to support autistic people and help reduce self-injury and provide a better coping mechanisms to deal with intense emotional feelings. I would like to thank Professor Florina Yusufovsky and my friends at the Bioempathy Lab. And the big thank you also goes to our dear colleagues at Bournemouth University, to Dr. Rachel Mosley and Dr. Nicola Gregory, and of course to all participants who generously participated in our study and trusted us with such a sensitive topic. And last but not least, thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. Mordi?
Time for one question.
Mordi? Sure. Mordi, yes. Regarding the calculation, well, we used, he asked me how did I calculate empathic disequilibrium, and well, this method of polynomial regression with response surface analysis is, well, it's just a regular polynomial regression. Yeah. So you use a polynomial regression with emotional and cognitive empathy in it, and then you can derive certain parameters to estimate both the lines of congruency. Yeah.
Morty, one more question?
Morty, sure.
Very interesting. Have you tried to relate alexithymia rates to disequilibrium?
Yes, definitely, and it is correlated. Yeah, sorry. I was asked if I try to correlate alexithymia to empathic disequilibrium, and the answer is yes. It is related to alexithymia in non-autistic population. I haven't looked at it in autistic people.